You're watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi. And it's a pleasure to be joined from Switzerland by Captain James Fanell. He's been the ex-Director Intelligence and Information Operations with the U.S. Pacific Fleet and currently is a fellow at the Geneva Center for Strategic Policy. Captain Fanell, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Sir, it's great to be here and it's an honor. Thank you.
Just going back into what I think you were among many people who are warning about the military rise of China way back, I think in 2013, 2014, and it got you into a bit of hot water while you were still serving. But just to recap where China is militarily now, and for those who were engaging around the world, and it's all countries, including the US and India, Southeast Asia, who were engaging, or some would say appeasing China. And now you see how China is being extremely belligerent on so many different fronts. Your views on that, Captain Fanell?
Yes, I think over the last 2 decades, we've watched the Chinese military go through a dramatic modernization period, a period where they were 20 years ago, at the turn of the century, they were what we would call a brown water navy. They didn't really go out much from their shores. And today, the Chinese Navy and their other military forces are operating around the globe. And the trajectory of that growth, both in the military platforms that were produced and the operations, are pretty dramatic. And yes, there were people that kind of ignored this. And the signals were there even 20 years ago. And what we had was a national policy, what I call the Kissinger School, that said we needed to engage with the PRC because if we engage with them, we could get them to essentially adopt the post-World War II international norms and standards. Now, we didn't think they'd become a democracy like India or the United States, but we thought at least they would support international norms and go along with everybody enjoying the fruits of that system. But instead, what we've seen, as you mentioned, a very belligerent attitude and an expansionist attitude. And now we're seeing China threaten Taiwan on a very significant basis on a daily, every day now this year in 2020. India, have had violence inflicted upon your military and people killed. There's disputes in the South China Sea. There's disputes and threats with Japan in the East China Sea. There's disputes with Mongolia along the inner Mongolian border. There's disputes with Russia on that border. And so what we see is
the Senkaku, which has been historic as well. You were talking about the warning signals that were ignored. Now, your assessment itself, when you're looking forward to, say, 2030, and the PLAN is what? You're looking at 450 ships and a submarine force approaching about 110, I believe, which will be more than the combined strength of the U.S. Navy and the Indian Navy. Plus, it's the firepower, as you are pointing out, in terms of anti-ship weaponry that China has, right? That's also worrying.
That's my biggest concern, is that the Chinese Navy has been built on a foundation that's a little bit different than the U.S. Navy that built about power projection and focused for the last 3 decades on projecting power ashore into hotspots in the Middle East. The Chinese military and the Chinese Navy specifically have been designed to sink the U.S. Pacific Fleet and the rest of the U.S. Navy, and I think any other navies that are like that. And so China has built submarines, surface ships, aircraft, and rocket forces from shore that are all designed and provided missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles that speed along at supersonic speed just off the wave tops and are very evasive and hard to defeat. In addition, ballistic missiles coming in from space that can come straight down on ships. And now we have new reports this year, and we saw in the Chinese 70th anniversary parade last year in Beijing, hypersonic missiles. And so China has developed a whole spectrum of weapons specifically designed to destroy the U.S. Navy and any other Navy that would get in their way, which would then allow them to have freedom of the seas and control of the seas and to do their bidding and to expand their Belt and Road as they see fit.
So, in other words, like you're saying, it's not a question just of maritime projection of power here, that China has a different model that it's working on. Is that, am I reading your views correctly?
Yeah, they are designing a military. In a way, it's a mirror of what the U.S. military has been in terms of trying to achieve a global power projection. They're not there yet, but by 2030 to 2045, we can expect to see the Chinese military operating much in greater depth around the world than they are today. As you all know from being right there in the front door, if you will, the Chinese have been operating for over a decade in the Gulf of Aden and steaming through the Indian Ocean with all kinds of ships and submarines. And now we're seeing their transport aircraft and bomber aircraft operating in Russia on a routine basis now. We've seen the Chinese Navy operate in the Mediterranean, in the Baltic. And so what I would expect to see over the next 15 to 20 years is a filling out of this capability to add in depth multiple more layers of capability that would allow them to essentially export this Belt and Road Initiative, which would try to overtake the existing trading alliances of the global economy and allow China to set the conditions and terms for who buys and sells what.
How dangerous do you find the situation? You mentioned Taiwan earlier, Captain Fanell. How dangerous do you find it in terms of, like you said, almost every day, whether it's aircraft flying over or they're having exercises in the area or ships in the area of Taiwan, and especially because they're seeing a lot of countries who are engaging with Taiwan a little bit more in an attempt to push back, starting with the U.S. itself, who's been sending top officials there. India has an official who has been sent, but not at such a high-profile level. How dangerous is the situation for Taiwan when the PRC is looking at its one China policy?
Well, I think it's very dangerous right now. This is unprecedented activity in terms of the PLA and their daily operations around Taiwan. You can think of a noose that goes around someone's neck, and the noose has been pulled very, very tight. And right now, it's like they're jerking it almost. And they're really trying to get the world's attention to say, we don't want you to do anything to change the relationship with Taiwan. Unfortunately, what it's done is it's emboldened, I think, people in Taiwan to really recognize from what they saw China do in Hong Kong with the one country, two systems, basically backtracking on that agreement. And now these threats to Taiwan militarily has caused a lot of people in Taiwan to kind of wake up and say, wow, we really have a threat, and maybe we do need to increase our relationships with the United States and other nations, allied nations, so that we can defend ourselves. And so I think right now we're at a cusp of a really critical time, and you'll see a lot of American officials. I think National Security Advisor O'Brien just made some comments this week regarding how difficult it would be for China to take Taiwan. And I think I agree with him that it will be very difficult for Beijing to do that. But I also believe that Beijing is actually planning to do it. And we need to be very concerned about that. And nations like India and the United States and Japan and Australia, our Quad, should all be standing up and telling Beijing, if you do this, you will be regretting the day that you would ever attempt that.
Is that enough? Because in the past, we've seen, I mean, if you go back to 2012, when we saw what happened in the Scarborough Shoals, there are countries in the area, in ASEAN, whether it's Thailand or Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, who are pushing back. But in the end, they are not really sure whether the Americans can and will, because they are at the moment the only one who can, fight back or push back against China in the maritime domain, whether they will be there when they are needed the most.
Right. You make a good point. In 2012 at Scarborough Shoal, the previous administration in the United States did not really send clear and unambiguous signals to China. In fact, many would say, and I am one of them, say that they actually turned their back on the Republic of Philippines, which is a treaty ally. And we can talk about that sometime else. But the fact of the matter is that sends shockwaves through the region. And so that's why I've been very vocal now to say to the public and to the administration, you need to be very unambiguous about what's going on in Taiwan, because Beijing has this experience from 2012 with Scarborough. They have 2012 to 2015 with the building of the seven artificial islands in the South China Sea. They have all this experience where they see the United States didn't stand up to them. And if we don't make it clear by our words and actions, I'm afraid that Beijing may think that they have an opportunity to do something.
Words and actions, when we're seeing what's happened in terms of freedom of navigation operations in the area, whether it's South China Sea, East China Sea, even further on, we've seen the U.S. Navy just a couple of months back. I think the Nimitz carrier battle group and another carrier battle group had passing exercises with the Indian Navy as well. There are bilateral exercises that continue, not just the US and India, Indonesia, and Australia, India, Japan. Are these enough to send a signal, or is there a need to actually impose costs on Beijing, on the PRC, on Xi Jinping, on the regime if they cross certain red lines?
I think the exercises, the bilateral exercises you mentioned between the U.S. Navy and the Indian Navy are huge signals to Beijing that there is a dramatic change in the geostrategic alliances and the formations in the world right now. And I'm very, very encouraged that the United States and India are talking together much more. You're going to have a 2+2 dialogue at the end of the month. I just saw this report that said there's a new maritime information sharing technical agreement that's been signed. For me, that's a great signal, because that talks about what I did in my career, which was sharing maritime operational intelligence. And when the Indian Navy and U.S. Navy share that kind of intelligence, and along with Japan and Australia, and really move out in a tangible way in the Quad, now China has to really consider, are they willing to do something like this? Because all four of our navies together are a counterweight to China. And that's just in the maritime domain. We have a lot of other domains that the four of us can get together in. So I think we need to not ratchet it up in terms of being reckless, but I think that the pathway that we're on is the right path to try to resolve this through deterrence. Deterrence based and backed up by real force.
And like you're saying, deterrence backed up by real force and in multi-dimensions. It's not just in the maritime or the military domain and the diplomatic, what you would probably call dime, I think. China uses CNP. In terms of the Quad, that's been moving slowly for various reasons. It died a death of sorts and was resurrected once Australia came on board. India is moving step by step in that direction as well. But that's also multi-dimensional, as you're pointing out. How important is the Quad, especially when we see how Beijing is reacting to any kind of developments that have been taking place in the Quad?
Well, I mean, Beijing is going to complain about anything that they perceive to be a disadvantage to them. So we've already seen this past week several articles where they were complaining about everybody ganging up on them. But the fact of the matter is, it's Beijing and the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party that have been the aggressors. And so what we're doing in this Quad arrangement, and we can talk about Quad Plus, because I don't think it's just restricted to four. So I think the four nations together leading the way attract people that say, hey, we want peace and stability, and we don't like to be blackmailed by the bullies in Beijing who are basically, putting a gun to their head and saying, do what we say, sign up to the agreements that we say, or we're going to, threaten you. Right now, Australia is under very extreme threat, not threat, but actual action economically from China, with boycotting a whole list of coal and cotton and wine and other things, trying to make a real impact on the Australian economy, and they're trying to knuckle them under. And we all need to, as you mentioned, a whole of government, a whole of society approach to confront what China's doing. And I think that's why the Quad is more than just an economic only or a military only. It has to be across all facets of national power.
Again, what you were earlier mentioning intelligence sharing between the US and India various other bilateral arrangements. We've seen logistics agreements being signed between India and the US, India and Japan, India and Australia. I think there will be one with Russia when the summit happens with Vladimir Putin as well. And there is talk that the last foundational agreement, as it's called, between the US and India, that's BECA, in addition to LEMA, will also be signed. How important are these in terms of interoperability? Well, one is, of course, when they are conducting maritime exercises currently, and when the need arises for them to act together.
It's absolutely essential that these agreements and the different facets of them be investigated, agreed upon, and then the sharing and the interoperability begin in earnest in the field. And so, for instance, logistics, people may say, well, what does that mean? Well, it's actually very, very important when U.S. and Indian navies can steam together and to be able to share oil, fuel, parts, ammunition. This kind of interoperability allows the two navies to operate continuously together and not to be separated by one or the other side having to break off to go get some parts or get some fuel from their own supplier. And it extends the ranges, it extends the network and the scope of their operational capability. So it's absolutely critical. And when you start operating in arenas like logistics and information intelligence sharing, then you get common understanding of operational tactics and techniques and procedures, so that now, like on a football team, an American football team, certain players do certain things and have certain jobs. Some people block, some people throw, some people catch the ball, and it all works together to make a very successful operation. And I think once we start doing that, and we have been, to be honest, it's not, some of it's not in the press, but this logistics information, I remember talking with some folks at the 7th Fleet 3 or 4 years ago, and they were talking about this logistics sharing and this understanding of how to make logistics interoperable in the region. And so I think we're well on the way of moving in that direction, and I think it's good.
And it has increased because you were mentioning, say, refueling or spare parts, some of the stuff we might not even know about. But there was a P-8, and U.S. P-8, which landed in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands just a few weeks back, and that was a first. It was refueled there. That's a very significant development, not only because it was the first time that was done, but because of the location, strategic location of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Well, not really at the mouth of the Malacca, but on the way there.
Yeah, that's that P-8 flight there was not only did it demonstrate logistical interoperability, but it also, I think, demonstrated the future of information and intelligence sharing, because our P-8s and your P-8s are going to be able to interoperate and really cover a large area in terms of ocean surveillance, and to be able to see who's out there, or if Chinese submarines, and tracking Chinese submarines that come in through the Strait of Malacca, and boom, they're in the Bay of Bengal and they're in the Indian Ocean. And so those two islands are really at the bottle. They can be the cork in the bottle in terms of the Malacca Strait. They're critically important. And I think I'm very pleased to see that there's efforts going on in India to reinforce them and to increase the infrastructure there, to allow maritime and naval forces to operate there and prevent kind of a barrier to untoward Chinese expansionism in the case of a crisis.
My final question to you, Captain Fanell, in terms of Chinese expansionism and what we've seen, which is, we don't care kind of an attitude. Do you think even if all the right signals, words, and actions are carried out jointly by like-minded countries, that China will be forced to change its kind of behavior?
Well, I think it won't do it if you just attack them, if you want to use the word attack, but if you just focus on the military domain. Yeah. We have to focus across all domains. And I think the one area that the world is really starting to come to a focus on in this year of COVID is the area of economics. And for too long, the world said, well, we're just going to let China produce all of our goods. We'll just send the raw materials there. They'll produce it for us and we'll buy it back. Well, I think now the world is saying, why are we doing that? And because every dollar that we would give to China, some percentage of that dollar or your rupee would go into building these machines of death that were designed to kill our sailors and airmen and military personnel. So we need to choke off their access to funds. And when we start choking them off from money, that will really have an impact on their behavior.
Captain Fanell, absolute pleasure sharing your insights and experience on StratNews Global. Thank you for your time, and we hope to keep coming back to you for more.
Thank you very much, Mr. Revi. It's very appreciated for me to be here.
The pleasure was all ours, and you can get onto our website if you like to support our kind of journalism. You've been watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.